Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Continuing a short series of why haven't we done a podcast on that yet? We're going to follow last week's podcast, which was born of me looking for that subject to send it to somebody and realizing we've never done a podcast on that topic. And we've got one this week, which is the exact same thing, which is that I was looking for a podcast to send to somebody, realizing that we've never done a podcast on this subject either. And so apparently there's just these sort of holes missing in, and you would think that they would have been done in like the first year. You would think that we would have done these really early on, but we didn't. So we're doing them now. So what we want to talk about today is why people end up really struggling to figure out the personality type. And when I say really struggling, I mean this is a major conundrum for some people. Not just oh gosh, I really wish I knew my type, or I'm trying to find it and I'm doing lots of reading. I mean like sometimes a years-long search that ends in frustration and tears and maybe sometimes eventually giving up and just going, I think this is all BS. Like this can be a real struggle for some people.
As we were talking about this show and kind of doing some show notes preparing, I kept throwing out ideas of people we know from our past of, well, what about this person? They were struggling. And you're like, no, they weren't struggling. They were just mistyped. They just thought they were the wrong type. I'm actually talking, Joel, about somebody that's struggling. They're desperate. They want, or not maybe not desperate, but they want to find their best fit type. And they've got maybe 2 or 3 types they're going between, and they're getting anxious. They're feeling overwhelmed. There's like emotion attached to this for a lot of people. And I think that is something we definitely want to focus on today. Is not somebody in your life maybe you're like, they're not the right type. But these are people that are actually eager to discover who they are, more about themselves. That's what we want to address today in this show.
Yeah, I mean, people who are mistyped, there's usually an emotional attachment to a certain personality type. There's an image in their mind of what that means, and they're over-identified with the image. That's usually what's going on for people mistyped. And there's a little bit of that sometimes that gets peppered into this struggle of trying to find your type, but it's a different beast altogether. And so you, the listener, if this is your experience, if you've been trying to figure out your personality type, possibly for years, we are going to break down, I don't know, like half a dozen reasons why a person might go through something like this or might be dealing with this, and do a little bit of a diagnostic and talk a little bit about what you can do in response to that. So the first reason is probably the easiest to observe, and that is a person can have a partial or incomplete understanding of the system. That includes both dichotomies and cognitive functions. So dichotomies are the 4-letter code element. That's introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging and perceiving. And you see maybe some of the most confusion around the elements that are part of our collective unconscious. That is to say, I mean, it doesn't take much to observe how the world has massively oversimplified the concept of introversion and extroversion. And so if you are a party animal, it is assumed you're an extrovert. And if you want to stay home with your cats all the time, it's assumed you're an introvert. And if you fall anywhere between those two things, then you sort of get categorized as either party animal or socially phobic. And there's no other image in anybody's mind other than those two things. So you see already that there's like incomplete understandings in our collective unconscious around some of these things. But as you go further down, then things get kind of confusing when you're talking about things like sensing and intuition. What does that actually mean? If you have gut feelings about things, if you listen to your intuition at all, does that mean you're automatically an intuitive? If you are a person who wants concrete reality and wants to see things verified in the outside world, if maybe you're a bit skeptical, does that mean you're automatically a sensor? So some of these terms can get really confusing. Thinking, feeling. If I'm a feeler, does that mean I'm not smart? If I'm a thinker, does that mean I'm an unfeeling robot? And judging and perceiving can get really complicated too. If I like my house to be in order, does that make me a judger? If I'm a person who's late, does that mean I'm automatically a perceiver? And the answer to all of those is no. Like those are oversimplified definitions that if we adopt only the the tip of the iceberg explanations, the explanations that live at the top that are accessible to most people, then when we have these sort of half understandings and incomplete understandings of them, it's very easy to identify with the other side of the dichotomy that we're actually falling on.
This is one of the reasons why when you discover, as you're listening now, you discovered cognitive functions, that was probably a eye-opening experience for you because it got away from just these dichotomies, introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, and you realize that, I'm all of these things. It's to what degree am I these? What degree are these showing up in my life? And that really is your personality, because we have all of those parts of ourselves. And our culture at large right now doesn't like distinctions a lot. Like, it wants to kind of say, well, everybody's everything all the time. And, to some degree, that's accurate. We are all very complex creatures that have a lot of parts to ourselves. And also there's trends and things that do have distinctions around them that we can latch onto. So there's this kind of push-pull between the dichotomies being very rigid. You're either an introvert or an extrovert. And once you get into the cognitive functions, you start to see, okay, there's much more fidelity of what that actually means. That means that maybe I lead with a function like extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness here. It's about getting results in the outside world. Technically, if you lead with that function, you're an extrovert. But you may not like spending time around people, which is our stereotype of what an extrovert looks like in our culture, because you want to get projects done, or you want to mess with systems or things outside yourself. Resource and managing resource and people could be a resource also, but you're not necessarily a party animal like Antonia talked about. You're doing external things or extroverted things with that function. So this is where it starts to get a little fuzzy for people, I think.
Well, and the functions also explain that people have both an extroverted and an introverted function that they're primarily relying upon. And so there is a part of us that is both, and it's just which one leads and which one supports. So that creates a little bit more fidelity, as you mentioned. We also have both an intuitive and sensing function. We also have both a thinking and a feeling function. And whether or not we're a judge or a perceiver has very little to do with organization versus free flow, with some people depending upon the construction of their functions and how they engage with them. So being a judger is having a preference for your decision-making being influenced by outer world determinants. And being a perceiver means your judging function, you have a preference for your decisions to be made by internal criteria. That's a way more complex way of looking at it than simply I like things to be put away versus I'm late all the time. Like, it's a very, very there's a lot more here and a lot of layers to the onion to unpeel. And so if we have this partial understanding of type and we have just sort of bits and pieces all over, and we attach to what we think we know, then as we learn more along, down the road, we have to be willing to modify our original assessments or our original speculations as we get more nuanced understanding over time. So that can sometimes be difficult. Sometimes we attach to something early on and are just certain that we're that thing. Then we get more information about how maybe we could be the other thing, but we haven't reevaluated because we got so attached to that original piece. But then now, as we're gaining more and more and more information, now things are simply not lining up and we're not sure why it's not resonating with us. For example, a person can attach to being an intuitive early on in their learning process. And they might be, let's say we're talking about somebody who's an ISFP. And ISFPs have a very strong relationship with their 10-year-old or tertiary function of introverted intuition or perspectives. And they combine that with a part of themselves that's quite introspective, introverted feeling or authenticity as their dominant or driver function. And so those two things in combination with each other, whenever they're going internal, feels very intuitive. And yet they're actually sensing types because their strength is with their perceiving function strength is an extroverted sensing or sensation in their engagement in the outside world and being present, being able to really read situations by being fully immersed in them. So an ISFP that early on may have heard oversimplified descriptions of what an intuitive is, and really sort of emotionally attached to it or very much identified with it. As their understanding becomes more rich and complex and nuanced, then they may really understand all of the functions, right? They might really understand what all of these things are, but because they got attached early on in the process, when they go further down the line and they're trying to self-diagnose which functions they're using, am I an INFP? Am I an ISFP? Am I an INFJ? It can get really complicated because they didn't detether from an earlier attachment. And so by the time they get to a place where they could very easily self-diagnose as ISFP, they're kind of messed up around it, right? Because they're like, oh, what does it mean if I'm not an intuitive? That's something that I thought from the very earliest times. And I think a part of this too could be type bias that people have in the communities, right? Intuitives, I think we're getting away from this, honestly, which is nice. Type communities are getting away from this idea that intuition is somehow superior to sensing. But I think for a long time, that was the case. And so a person maybe 5-6 years ago may have engaged with material, emotionally attached to being an intuitive because they thought it was like part of the quote unquote cool kid club or something in the type community. They get more nuanced understanding, and now they're trying to reconcile what they know about functions with this emotional attachment they had from times past. I've not just seen this with intuition, I've also seen this with thinking. There are people who get really, really attached to this idea of being a thinker. And then as their understanding becomes more and more nuanced, they should be able to adjust for that more nuanced understanding, but they're not really seeing that emotional cord going to the belief that they started out with. So one of the things a person can do as they're trying to figure out their type, if they're really struggling through, is to take an honest assessment if they emotionally attach to something early in their process that they're not even maybe conscious of anymore, and that they might need to detether from and be okay with letting that early understanding go in favor of the more complex understanding they're gaining.
As we talk about this first part where there's a partial understanding or an incomplete understanding, I haven't had that experience with people that come as students to our profiler training event or our profiler training program. Often what I see there is so there's this phenomenon in typing when somebody comes to a profiler training and we're talking about their family or friends that are really close to them. Sometimes it's hard for those people to know their parents or their brother and sister or their friends' personality types because they know them so well, the person. You can see all the exceptions to the rule. It's hard to almost see the pattern because you know all the exceptions that person individually has that might be against type because you see the richness of the complexity of the human being, which no human being is one of 16 types. Like that's just a way to see us, right? So I think the same phenomenon happens at the personal level. Some people, it's not a partial or incomplete understanding of the system. It's they know the system so well and they know themselves, like they're in their own experience so much that they can see all the exceptions to the rule all the time. So it's almost like you know too much. You know yourself too much and the system fully in its complexity. And that, I think, is the opposite side of the same coin, where it can be difficult to understand how you're wired. It's like a fish in water. You're in the experience so much. How are you going to know? You almost need to see it from the outside of yourself somehow.
And this probably affects people using introverted feeling or authenticity, maybe even more than other types. Because introverted feeling is a very introspective function that is designed to look at the chorus of complexity within, right? You're looking at every aspect of who you are. And you're going to spot all 8 functions inside. You're going to spot all 4 dichotomies inside because they exist in there. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out which one is the dominant if you're trying to give them all preference, right? Now, sometimes just the fact that a person struggles to figure out which one is the more dominant element of them, to me, triggers that I'm talking to an FP. I'm talking to somebody with introverted feeling, or maybe a TJ that has introverted feeling or authenticity as their 10-year-old or tertiary function, because that makes it harder to spot all of those components.
Not always, not 100% of the time. It's just an indicator for you.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think the other one here is introverted intuition or perspectives, which is the ability to observe the patterns that are going on internally. And while to some extent that pattern recognition can give them an even better access to how their mind is programmed and wired, there's a piece of it that can sometimes get confused because programming inside of ourselves is not always predictive, right? Sometimes we get patterns that go contrary to our type because of other factors that we're actually going to talk about in just a moment. And so because of that, if they can see these other patterns, then sometimes they get false reads as well. So there are cognitive reasons, reasons woven within the system, quite honestly, that are sort of misdirects. And sometimes you have to get familiar enough with what different types get confused by in order to understand why the individual is experiencing confusion, because that's actually predictive for their type. It's hard for FPs or people who use introverted feeling. It's hard for them to settle on one description of themselves. That is part of the confusion of being an FP. And so if you understand that that's part of the confusion, then when you identify that component of confusion, you can go, okay, that's why I was confused to begin with. And not everybody who's struggling to figure out their type is an FP. It's just that's why those types tend to be confused. So understanding that there's more depth of pattern here than simply the functions or the dichotomies. There's like these holistic patterns that run throughout, and getting more and more familiar with those can sometimes diagnose why a person is struggling. Not to mention that the polarity of a function can sometimes look like a specific function. For example, introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. These are polarities of cognitive functions, which means that they are two sides of the same coin. And sometimes when introverted sensing and extroverted intuition are being used well, they can appear to be the same as introverted intuition, because it's pattern recognition that's happening internal. That is, a person is reviewing an experience that they had and gaining ahas from the review, like patterning what actually was going on there in the review, which means it's almost like post-processed extroverted intuition, which can sometimes appear to be like introverted intuition, which is slightly different. Introverted intuition and its polarity opposite of extroverted sensing is running simulations of realities though not beheld. And so there's some distinction here that can sometimes get really confusing. Now, for you, the listener, if you're like, listen, I'm listening because I'm struggling with my type and you guys are talking about way complex things, all we're doing right now is really sympathizing with where the struggle can be, because this is not necessarily super obvious and easy. Now, when we teach people how to profile, we say go for low-hanging fruit, which means that go for the thing that is the most obvious and the simplest and easiest. Bearing in mind that you may have emotionally attached to something early on in your process that you need to reevaluate now. But if you sort of emotionally remove all of those cords and tethers to things you want, and you go to a neutral space, and then you call up all of the information you've learned so far, that's a really great space to start looking for low-hanging fruit. That's a good place to go, am I actually a sensor and not an intuitive? Or am I actually a feeler and not a thinker? Or whatever it is. Am I actually a judger and not a perceiver? There's a lot of judgers out there that don't want to see themselves as judgers because they think it's unfun. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. But there are judgers who think they're perceivers because they want to be the more fun type. Well, what if you're just a fun judger? What about that? So emotionally let go, get to a neutral space, and then ask yourself what you know at this time in your investigation, and then go, hey, maybe I actually am a judger. I mean, my closet is actually pretty organized and my car is clean, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's not, but you get anxious when that's the case, right? So again, oversimplifications, but just ask yourself what's the low-hanging fruit.
As we talk about oversimplifications, let's move on to another reason why you might be struggling with your personality type or someone in your life that you know. And this can be related to oversimplifying the prototypes in your life. You might have an oversimplification of what this one personality type looks like, and your Uncle Bob is that type, and maybe your dad or your brother's that type, and you're like, well, I mean, on paper, I should be that type, but I'm not anything like those three people in my life, so I can't be that type. And you've got this oversimplified way that this type should show up to the world. Like, if I was to look at type descriptions or stereotypes about ENFPs, I'm supposed to be running around chasing INTJs and trying to vomit rainbows on their heads all the time. Like, that's kind of like the the funny thing online, the memes online, and kind of the way ENFPs are talked about. Like, I just want to just vomit rainbows all over the place. And so if I got attached to that, I'd be like, well, I don't identify with that. I must not be an ENFP because that's not how I show up to the world. That's kind of a silly example, but I think this happens for people. They see an example of what this type must be like, or more importantly, someone in your life that is that type. I think that's really where it gets in there and starts to mess with you. And you're like, I just can't, I'm not, you're turned off by somebody that's like that.
Yeah, I recently talked to somebody who believed that they were an INFJ. And as I was talking to them, my suspicion is actually that they were an INTJ, which is rare, actually. It's rare when an INTJ believes they're an INFJ. That usually happens in reverse. But as we were talking, they were mentioning a parent that they believed is an INTJ and started to describe characteristics of this parent. Characteristics that are not particular to INTJs. Like sometimes an INTJ can behave in this way, and they might have some trending if they're unhealthy. But the characteristics were really things that are sort of undesirable in anybody that would be evidencing them. But this person had created an association between being an INTJ and some of these qualities. And so they didn't identify with those qualities, and so they must not be an INTJ. And yet, as I was talking to them, I was like, you have INTJ problems, you have INTJ challenges and perspectives. So I could understand why this person, in an attempt to distance themselves from this parent and these undesirable characteristics, that they had said, I must be a different type. When in reality, I think they were just a more compassionate, well-developed version of the type than this parent was. So I think that happens. Like you're talking about these sort of oversimplified prototypes. This person in my life is this type, and I don't identify with XYZ characteristics that may have nothing to do with the type or may just be evidenced by the type in certain ways. Well, I don't really identify with that, so I must be something different. And then the struggle happens, right? This inability to land on a best fit type because nothing quite feels right, when really they've disqualified something that would feel right if they could separate it from the characteristics that actually don't have anything to do with personality types.
Or characteristics they do like, somebody they really vibe with, and they feel you might think to yourself, well, I got to be this type. I'm so connected to this person. I'm so much like this person. We've got so much in common, so many shared values and interests. Of course I'm this type. I think that's the other thing that can happen on the other side of that coin.
Yeah, I've seen so many recently. I was surprised to discover so many ESTJs that believe they're ENTPs. And in large part because they can really identify with the extroverted intuition component of an ENTP, right? Or that's their 10-year-old or tertiary. For ENTPs, it's the driver or dominant. And so because they really got that component of it, and because they're a thinker, there's an identification with sort of how that type shows up. And they want to show up that way, or they even maybe do show up in similar ways. So then there's this assumption that they're a type different than they actually are. And I think another component here is not just I vibe with that person, so I must be the same type. It can also be that person's too cool. That type is too cool for me. They almost pedestal their own best fit type, which is actually something that makes sense since there's a thing called type patriotism, which is that on some level, all of us think our type is the best, and we can't help it. It's our type, right? It's how we see the world. So there's nothing wrong with a little bit of type patriotism. I say we think it's the best. Type patriotism might have a little bit of it's the best, but it's like it should be friendly competition the best. Kind of like my country has better beer, right? Like, I mean, does it really have better beer? Well, I like to think it does, right? It's like that kind of patriotism. But as long as it's friendly, then I think there's nothing wrong with really loving your personality type. But some people who don't feel they have permission to be quote unquote that cool will pedestal their best fit type and think other people of that type are really awesome, but not give themselves permission to own it. And then those people will also end up in a struggle situation because none of the other 15 types really matches them.
So those are some of the, I would say, low-hanging fruit, easy ones to talk about. Let's get a little bit under the surface here now, maybe some motivations and some unconscious motivations. Let's talk about those. One of the things I think in another category is this overimportance on personality type, thinking in terms of the system itself, the overimportance on finding your type or the expectations of when you find your type, what that means, like how much that's going to change your life. If only I could get my type right, everything in my life is going to be fixed. I've got so much expectation riding on me getting this type right. Well, no wonder you might be struggling between 1, 2, or 3 different types because there's so much riding on it. If you don't get this right, if you make the wrong choice and you start developing yourself or making choices based on the wrong type, your trajectory is going to be terrible and you might crash and burn. I mean, this is in your unconscious, right? This is what you might think. And if you get it right, your life's going to be happy and you're going to have the relationship and job and career you want. Everything's going to be perfect. So you've got to get it right. You've got this one shot or this time period of struggle to figure this out. And it's really, 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 really important.
This is a double-edged sword, by the way. One of two things comes from this, quote unquote, everything hinges on me figuring out my type. The first one is that there's a time period of introspection that's required when you're looking for your best fit type, especially if you might be a little bit difficult to diagnose. And for some people, it's the only introspection they've done ever, right? This is like their first real experience with introspection. Or maybe introspection on this level. Maybe they're somebody who has a naturally more introspective personality type, but they haven't done this level of self-evaluation. And their unconscious mind, and by the way, this is a bit of a controversial opinion, right? This is a little bit of not self-sabotage, but self-trickery that you may not resonate with, but I think that this is something that does happen, so I think it's important to mention it. If it's a time period of introspection and self-evaluation and your brain goes, this is what we need right now. We need to be diving deep and going inside. There may be a little bit of self-sabotage around finding your best fit type because your brain wants a longer experience of this introspection. It feels like it needs it. And so you may be unconsciously, intentionally kicking the can down the road of finding your type because this is actually a time period of thrashing for you. It's a time period of figuring some big stuff out. And if you figure out your personality type, you might maybe feel like the loop is closed and move on with your life and not stay in this place of introspection. So that's one half of what can happen if you put so much on this figuring out your type. The second thing that can happen is and it's actually almost like inverse, right? It's like the exact opposite phenomenon of this is a good introspective time for me, so my brain is setting up the system to keep going. The other option is that you are an introspective person. You are a person who is naturally given to doing self-reflection and deep work. And once you figure out your type, you're going to have clarity and you're going to have to make peace with a bunch of stuff. All of a sudden work that maybe you are procrastinating is instinctively that once you get clarity on this, the work you've been procrastinating is going to flood in. And now you're going to have to make peace with a bunch of other stuff. So on one side, it can be that you're unconsciously, intentionally putting it off because you're doing reflective work you need to do and your brain knows that. And on the other side, you're unconsciously, intentionally putting it off because your brain doesn't want to do work. It's terrified of what's coming next. And so if you fall in the category of everything rides on this is super important. Try to figure out if something like this is happening under the surface. Are you, again, unconsciously but intentionally sabotaging yourself because this is a thrashing you need to do, or it's a thrashing that you're doing in order to put off the work you actually need to do?
I think you're spot on there. I mean, I know you said it's controversial. Maybe. I don't know. But I think it certainly takes self-awareness to know if you are using finding your type to continue this inner growth journey of yourself, this reflective time period for yourself, or if you're delaying action by stewing in trying to find your type. That's a hard thing to get a handle of, like to really see that in yourself. I mean, you have to really pay attention and focus in and be very self-aware of what your motivations might be in that. And you might need some help. Maybe a friend or someone can help spot that for you if you have a conversation. And I think that is something just to be aware of. If you're struggling, you could ask yourself, what would a deeper reason for me to be struggling here be? Why would my unconscious mind want a lack of clarity or want the struggle that I'm finding myself in here.
Yeah, there's almost always a reason why we are thrashing, right? Thrashing is something that oftentimes is necessary. So if you do an honest assessment and this is something that you think might be happening for you, the ways to solve it is, number one, commit to staying in an introspective space even after you land on your best fit type. If you promise your brain that once you figure out your best fit type, you're not going to just simply close the loop and move on with your life, that you're going to use this newfound information to continue to deep dive, your brain might, I know that this is weird, like I'm personifying the brain as if it's doing all sorts of stuff to itself, but it really is actually. That's kind of how the brain works. It's a slippery one. It does a lot of self-sabotage. It does a lot of sublimating its intent, right? Like a big piece of inner work is figuring out how we're tricking ourselves all the time. And so if you commit to your brain, as weird as that sounds, that you're going to stay in a space of self-reflection even after you figure out your type, and in fact will have tools to do it better, then there might be this, the unconscious intentional might then let go of the need to hold onto it in order to continue doing the introspective work that it wants to be doing. And then again, on the other side, which is that you're kicking the can down the road of some deep inner work, of course, obviously the solution is to make peace with whatever truth you're avoiding. One of the challenges to figuring out your type and getting clarity on it is that a floodgate of other ahas and insights will now rush in. And while that can be very scary, and I completely understand that as somebody who's done the same inner work, right? Really, really scary inner work. There's the phrase, the way out is through, and just making peace with it, just surrendering to the work that needs to be done afterwards, and knowing that you have the capacity to do that inner work, you have the capacity to navigate through it. And when you come out the other side, not only will you know your best fit type, but you'll have done some very important inner game work that probably has been stacking for a while anyway. So the reward is at the end of the journey, and it's okay that it's been a bit of thrashing to get there. All of it is important work to be done.
By the way, if you're hearing a crackling on the audio, I think there's a thunderstorm going on outside. It's driving me crazy, that like noise, that crackling noise in the recording, and I can't seem to get it to stop. So I think it's an electrical storm that's causing that if you're hearing it. It's driving you crazy too. The next thing I think on the list here is expectations and influences from the people in your life or culture at large. Like there's a lot of people in your life, family, friends, maybe the culture out there that has these expectations that you feel compelled to meet. There's probably people in your family, maybe it's not even overt expectations, like you've got to be one of us, but it might just be a family culture you come from when everybody's very perceivery, like they show up as perceivers. Maybe they're not even perceivers, but the culture of the family is perceivers. Maybe the dominant personalities, mom or dad in the family, had a certain style, and that was the culture the family adopted, and now you've kind of mapped yourself or modeled yourself after your family's culture or your friendship culture, the circle of friends you hang out with. If you're outside of a family as a child and you're in adult life, there's people around you that you pick up their behaviors and patterns and the expectations they have. And sometimes this can be a struggle because you want to show up fitting into the culture well. And also it makes you maybe struggle with how you find yourself, the personality type you show up with. We talked earlier about introverted feeling having a little bit of a struggle because they can find people that use that function, often, not always, struggle because they can find so many of their inner parts, inner expressions, all the nuance of identity and how they show up to the world. Well, I think this cultural thing really can potentially be a struggle for extroverted feeling types or anyone that has it in their cognitive function stack, quite frankly. If you have extroverted feeling, we've nicknamed it harmony, you are automatically looking for ways to connect and tie into the culture around you. So often when we see people struggling with personality type because of family culture or culture at large, it often has to do with that extroverted feeling, struggling with, well, what's me? Where do I end and my personality? And what am I picking up as behaviors or ways of being from the expectations of the people around me?
I see that particularly in IFJs. IFJs will have a sort of flexibility to how they see their type. and they can absorb components from particularly partners. I've seen INFJs type as INTJs because they're married to a TJ and they've adopted a lot of their values. So I think that's not uncommon. I can think of FE primaries, or extroverted feeling drivers. Our nephew Dimitri, who's an ESFJ, his father's an ESFP, and they're very close. And a lot of Dimitri's behaviors or sort of affectations and modality of engagement was very much influenced by his ESFP father. So he shows up almost like he's an ESFP. And it doesn't help that he's also an Enneagram 7. So he's an ESFJ, Enneagram 7, raised by an ESFP. So for a while there, it was kind of tough to figure out his type. And that happens. So one of the antidotes to this is if you are still in a place of struggling to figure out your type, and you know type well enough to be able to diagnose it in others, or at least get an idea, one of the things you can do is create a quote-unquote family tree. You can look at the people, particularly in your immediate family or anybody who was highly influential, and figure out what their types were and ask yourself what you adopted as an expectation to meet their approval, or what were the ways that you were able to interact or connect with them, and how maybe did that alter how you showed up. And I think that's something that can also actually bleed outside of just your immediate family, but also into maybe a congregation or any other institution that you're a part of. It doesn't just have to be a congregation religious, but it can also be, like a local town or culture of your town or city. And then it can extend out to a demographic that you feel, that you really identify with, because each demographic is also going to have characteristics that look more like certain types than others. So do a little bit of a diagnostic around you and ask yourself, how are you meeting them in the middle? And how has that maybe sacrificed or compromised some of the elements that are more natural or native to you in an effort to be more quote unquote normal?
Finally, I think growth comes in at our last point. There's this idea, we almost see growth on a bell curve. And there's no judgment here. It's just people that have done a lot of introspection, a lot of personal growth work, maybe are very far on the one side of the bell curve, like developed, and people that haven't done any at all. They're maybe not interested, or they're just not mature enough, or they're not at that stage in their life, are on the other side of the bell curve. And most people fall in the middle. Most people have done some personal growth just by default through life, and maybe not all aspects of your life, but something you've grown around. It's very rare when you've done tons and tons and tons of work on every aspect of your life. And it's very rare when you've done absolutely nothing and you haven't been self-reflective at all. And when you're on one of those polar extremes, this is what we talk about in our profiler training class too, when you're profiling somebody and you're really struggling to profile them in a profiling session, usually you could point to one of those extremes on that bell curve, or somewhere on the edges. Usually they're not somebody in the middle. And that might be you listening to. If you're struggling with your type, it could be, my guess is you've done maybe a lot of work because you're listening to programs like this and podcasts like ours, and you're probably interested in personal growth and looking for typology to grow even more. So my guess is that you probably are invested in personal growth, and that might be a struggle because of that. But maybe this is something new for you. You might be just young, or this might be one of your first steps in growth in your life, and you are still getting your sea legs, your training wheels on how to grow. And so maybe that's part of why you're struggling right now in your type, is you're uncalibrated to where you are in life as far as how you're navigating your personal growth journey.
My observation has been that when a person hasn't done much growth, or maybe hasn't done any, and might actually be a little unhealthy, oftentimes that's when they attach to a different type than they are, because they want to fulfill an expectation and they're avoiding the work that knowing their type would actually, afford them, or not afford them, but would basically require of them to some extent. It's usually people who have done quite a bit of development that struggle to find their type. And regardless, whether or not it's a person, whether or not you are somebody who's on the done a lot of growth bell curve side, or has done very little and just entering this space, the answer to this is to grab the few types that you're going between. Because I've not known anybody who's struggling to figure out their type that hasn't narrowed it down to, like 3, 4 max. Usually it's 4 at the max. Oftentimes it's 2 or 3. And if you're in that space where you're going between 2 and 3, possibly as many as 4, figure out the developmental path of those 3 or 4 types. How do they grow and change? What is the story that those types oftentimes go through as they're developing and integrating these different cognitive functions? And the rule of thumb is that particularly well-developed people have a very well-developed dominant function that is very rewarding, and they put it through a lot of different challenges. And so it's not just something that they use, but it's actually a muscle that they've developed. And then they go to their auxiliary or co-pilot function and really develop that one as well as a perfect complement to their dominant or driver. And then the next place seems to be that when you do all of this work in your auxiliary or co-pilot function, you very naturally have a tension that starts to form between that co-pilot and the 10-year-old or the auxiliary and tertiary. And so that seems to be the next natural place. And then finally, you start to see opportunities and the need to integrate the 3-year-old or their inferior function. And so that usually is the sort of the developmental path. And sometimes what comes in here too, which can throw type off a lot, so it oftentimes isn't something that's first, it's usually something that's down the line, is the integration or the development of the 6th function. Now, the 6th function is a shadow function. We don't oftentimes talk about shadow functions for a reason. We don't want to throw people too much off their growth path by getting into shadow functions when they're not ready for them. But the 6th function is the same as the auxiliary or co-pilot, but in an opposite attitude. And remember from previous podcasts, the attitude is the introverted or the extroverted orientation of the function. So effectively what that would look like is, as an ENTP, my auxiliary or co-pilot function is introverted thinking. So therefore my 6th function would be extroverted thinking. For Joel, he's an ENFP. His 2nd or auxiliary function is introverted feeling. That would make his 6th function extroverted feeling, and down the line. So an integration of that oftentimes starts to surface around the time period that you've really nailed down or solidified the integration of the 3-year-old or inferior function as an aspiration, and is something that creates a ballast to the dominant. So with all of that, of course, we've recorded podcasts on different ways to develop these functions, some ideas and concepts on how the systems are flayed out. And so get a chart of the 2 or 3 or 4, usually max, types that you're going between, and then ask yourself what it would look like if I really developed that dominant function well. What would it have looked like if I had spent time developing that auxiliary function? What would a balance of that auxiliary and tertiary or co-pilot and 10-year-old look like? And just sort of map it out in front of you and ask which one follows my developmental path the closest. Which one do I really can see myself having done over a timeline? It's not something that I would have immediately just come out of the hatch with, but something that maybe when, maybe you're an INP and you're trying to figure out whether or not you're an INP or an INJ, and you realized all of your growth happened when you took chances. You took risks. You didn't play it safe. You were willing to put yourself in situations that were crazy or adventurous or just got you out of your shell. If that's the case, you're more likely to be an INP than an INJ. If you figured out your developmental path came more in buckling down and organizing your world and forming better relationships with other people and creating systems in your life, you're more likely an INJ. So look at these developmental paths and figure out which one that you most closely align with. And if you are having a challenge figuring out your best fit type because you are on the well-developed side of the bell curve, this will probably be the thing that is the leverage point in identifying your type.
So hang in there. If you identify with this idea, or maybe there's somebody in your life that's a friend of yours that's struggling, hang in there. Like, part of the exploration process, the struggle, I think is good. I think it's a really powerful thing. It does give you an opportunity for that self-reflection, that look into who you are as an individual, how you're wired, how you're showing up. I think there's value in the struggle itself. What are we missing, though, from this list? What's coming up for you? Maybe you've been struggling with finding your best fit type between a couple types. What's your reason why you think you're struggling there? Maybe don't even think about the types themselves, but get into the hood of your mind and say, why am I struggling with this? What is going on for me that's making this such a challenge? Maybe there's an external problem in your world, something out there that you can identify, but maybe it's internal. Maybe there's something in your unconscious or your mindset that's tripping you up. Or maybe philosophically, you have a viewpoint or something that's giving you some challenge here in understanding how you're wired or what type is best fit for you. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe you also have an experience of solving this challenge where you were struggling between a couple types and you arrived at the best fit type, and it's been wonderful. It's been a great experience for you. We'd love to hear your story. What is your story? What are your questions? What are your comments? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave your comment, ask your questions, or share your story, personalityhacker.com.
I will say this, that my observation has been that people who really struggle to figure out their type, and they do so, they figure it out eventually by being students of the functions in particular. They're some of the people who have the best grasp of the system because they had to get really good at creating distinctions between what the dichotomies really mean, what the functions really mean, what the polarities really are all about. So part of the value in this is not only does it give you a time period of introspection, but it also gives you a time to get really good at creating distinctions and dissecting the system itself. So don't despair. There is actually good that comes with the thrashing. And also, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. That helps us out a lot. Our book is out. It's at Amazon, Books A Million, and all major retailers. If you enjoy it, you can leave a rating and review for us on Amazon. That also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have a suite of programs. The reason why we're able to do this, run this podcast for 6+ years at this point, ad-free, is because it is subsidized by our programs. And if you would like to invest in yourself and find a personal development program that is right for you based on your personality type, I highly recommend going to personalityhacker.com and looking at our catalog of programs.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.